He spent his life savings on a girl he'd never met, but he wasn't buying a wife. He was buying a secret, and that secret was about to get them both killed. The man's name was Jesse Boone, and he rode into the sorry excuse for a town called Cedar Ridge, with dust on his coat and a storm in his eyes. He was looking for supplies, a hot meal, maybe a moment of peace. But peace wasn't on the menu in Cedar Ridge. Not that day. Behind Murphy's trading post, in a courtyard of mud and misery, a crowd had gathered. They weren't watching a dogfight or a card game. They were watching an auction, and the property for sale was a 19-year-old girl. Her name was Joyce Palmer. She stood on a rickety crate, shivering, wrists tied, her dress looking like it had been through a war. The men around her weren't men, not really. They were vultures picking at the bones of her dignity with crude jokes and greedy eyes. A grizzled prospector with tobacco staining his beard spat and yelled, "$20 for the girl." Another, his face shadowed by a grimy hat, shot back, "30." From the porch of the trading post, a man named Frank Dalton watched the bidding, a flask of cheap whiskey in his hand. He was supposed to be her guardian. He was the one selling her. "Come now, gentlemen," he slurred, a foul grin spreading across his face. "She's worth more than that. Young enough to learn whatever you need her to." Joyce just stared at the mud. Hope was a luxury she'd learned to live without. She'd learned that dreams just give the world a better target to aim for. She expected nothing. She hoped for nothing. And that's when a new voice cut through the air, sharp and cold as a razor. "How much for all of you to leave her alone?" Every head turned. There, on a tall black horse, sat Jesse Boone. His face was weathered, his hand resting near the worn leather of his gun belt. But it wasn't a threat. It was a promise. Frank Dalton squinted, the morning sun too bright for his whiskey-soaked eyes. "What's that now?" Jesse's voice didn't waver. "You heard me. Name your price. I'll pay it. And then the girl comes with me." A nervous murmur rippled through the crowd. This wasn't part of the show. Frank's greedy eyes lit up. He saw a fool, a soft-hearted traveler ripe for the picking. He was about to learn just how wrong he was. $50, Frank said, the number tasting sweet on his tongue. It was more money than he'd seen in a year. Without a word, without even a flicker of hesitation, Jesse reached into his saddlebag, pulled out a heavy leather pouch, and tossed it into the mud at Frank's feet. The sound of the coins hitting the ground was the sound of a life being bought and sold. "Done," Jesse said. And with that single word, the world shifted on its axis. Frank scrambled for the coins like a pig in the slop, while the other men just grumbled and walked away, their morning's entertainment spoiled. But Joyce? Joyce didn't move. She stood there on that crate, perfectly still, like she was a ghost, afraid that any movement might break the spell and send her right back to hell. Jesse swung down from his horse. He didn't swagger. He didn't rush. He moved with the slow, deliberate patience of a man who understood fear. He walked toward Joyce, and for a terrifying second, she saw the glint of a knife in his hand. She flinched, bracing for the cut. But it never came. In one smooth motion, he sliced through the ropes binding her wrists, and the knife was gone as quickly as it had appeared. The frayed ends of the rope fell into the mud. She was free. But what did that even mean? "My name is Jesse Boone," he said, his voice quiet, a low rumble that seemed to come from the earth itself. "I have a ranch, half a day's ride from here. You're welcome to it, or I can take you anywhere else you want to go." For the first time, Joyce looked up. She looked past the mud, past the jeering faces, and met the eyes of the stranger who had just bought her. She wasn't sure what she was looking for. Cruelty, hunger, pity. But she didn't see any of that. She saw something she'd almost forgotten existed, something that felt like a distant memory from another life. Kindness. "I don't have anywhere else to go," she whispered, her voice cracking from disuse. He just nodded, as if he'd expected that answer, and gently helped her onto his horse. As they rode out of Cedar Ridge, Joyce kept her head down. She couldn't shake the feeling that this was just a different kind of cage. A nicer one, maybe, but a cage all the same. She didn't know it yet, but she was wrong. This wasn't a cage. It was the beginning of a war. And Jesse hadn't just bought her freedom, he'd just fired the first shot. The ride to his ranch was silent. Not a comfortable silence, but a heavy one, thick with questions neither of them dared to ask. The path they took was strange. It wasn't the main road. It was a winding hidden trail that snaked through canyons and dense pine forests. It was the kind of trail a man takes when he doesn't want to be followed. Joyce watched the back of his neck, the way his shoulders were set, constantly scanning the ridgeline. This wasn't a man taking a leisurely ride home. This was a man on alert. He was expecting something, or someone. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig made his whole body tense. He was a hunter, or he was the hunted. Joyce couldn't tell which. Finally, the trees parted, and they emerged into a small hidden valley. It was beautiful, protected on all sides by tall, pine-covered hills. A small log cabin with a stone chimney sat in the center, a well-tended barn and neat corrals beside it. It was peaceful. It was quiet. It was safe. Or at least, it was supposed to be. "It's not much," Jesse said, his voice softer now, as he helped her down from the horse. "But it's safe." Joyce looked at the place. After months of filth and fear, the simple orderliness of it felt like a dream. Inside, the cabin was spotless. A large, comfortable-looking bed with a faded quilt took up one corner. Against the far wall, a narrow cot had been set up, as if in a hurry. "You take the bed," Jesse said before she could even ask. "I prefer sleeping outside most nights anyway." Joyce finally found her voice. She turned to him, the confusion and suspicion swirling inside her, finally bubbling to the surface. "Why?" she asked. "Why are you doing this? What do you want from me?" Jesse took off his hat, turning it over and over in his calloused hands. He stared at the floor for a long moment, as if gathering his thoughts from a deep, dark place. When he finally looked up, the kindness in his eyes was still there, but it was shadowed by a grief so profound it seemed to suck the air from the room. "My wife," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Her name was Clara. A fever took her. 3 winters ago. I couldn't do anything. I just watched her go." He met Joyce's gaze, and in that moment, she saw a pain that mirrored her own, a deep, soul-crushing loss. "I couldn't save her," he said, "but when I saw you, I don't know. I just figured, maybe I can do right by someone else. Maybe I can save someone." It was a simple explanation. Too simple. Joyce wanted to believe him. Every part of her screamed to believe him. But something felt off. A tiny, jagged piece of the puzzle that didn't quite fit. That night, as she lay in the softest bed she could remember, she listened to the sounds of him banking the fire and settling onto the cot. For the first time in months, she was safe. She was warm. She was clean. So why did she feel more afraid than ever before? She drifted off to sleep, but her dreams were filled with the image of his eyes. Not the kind eyes he showed her, but the hard, calculating eyes of the man who had scanned the ridgeline. The man who knew how to navigate a trail designed to hide from the world. The man who wasn't just a simple rancher. He wasn't just a good Samaritan. He was something else entirely. And she had a terrifying feeling she was about to find out what. The days that followed were a strange kind of paradise. Jesse was a ghost. He would chop wood while she slept, leaving a fresh pile by the door. He'd leave a simple breakfast on the table and then disappear to tend his animals, only returning in the evening. He never pushed her. He never demanded anything. He just gave her space. He gave her silence. He gave her peace. And slowly, cautiously, Joyce started to feel human again. One morning he found her on her hands and knees, scrubbing the already clean floorboards with a frantic energy. "You don't have to earn your keep," he said gently from the doorway. She stopped, soap suds on her raw hands. "I don't know how to just be," she admitted. "I've always had to be useful. Or else." "Or else what?" he asked, his voice soft, but his eyes hard. "Or else they'd remind me I was a burden," she whispered, "that I should be grateful for whatever they gave me." Jesse's jaw tightened. A muscle pulsed in his cheek. "Well, you're not a burden here," he said. "You're a person. You deserve to be treated like one." The words hit her like a physical blow, a simple statement of fact, but it was a fact she had forgotten. And as she looked at him, standing there in the morning light. Something inside her, a tiny flicker of a flame she thought had been extinguished forever, began to glow. But trust is a fragile thing, and her instincts were still screaming that something was wrong. One afternoon while Jesse was out checking his fences, Joyce started to explore the cabin. It was his home, but it felt strangely impersonal. There were no pictures, no trinkets, nothing that spoke of the woman, Clara, who had supposedly lived and died here. It was too clean, too sparse. It felt less like a home and more like a safe house. In the corner near the big bed was a small wooden chest. His chest. She knew she shouldn't. She knew it was a violation of the fragile peace between them, but she couldn't help it. The feeling that she was living in a lie was too strong to ignore. Her fingers trembled as she lifted the heavy lid. Inside were simple things: spare clothes, a box of bullets, a worn Bible, and underneath it all, wrapped in oilcloth, was a small, leather-bound journal. It wasn't his. The handwriting was delicate, feminine. Clara's. Her heart pounded as she opened it. She was expecting entries about a loving husband, about building a life in this valley. But that's not what she found. The first few pages were normal enough, but then the tone shifted. The entries became shorter, more frantic. He's not who he says he is. He came here looking for something. He talks in his sleep. He says a name, not mine. He says, Palmer. Joyce's blood ran cold. Palmer. Her name. She flipped through the pages, her hands shaking so badly she could barely read. The last entry was scrawled and barely legible, written in a panic. Dalton was here. They know. They know about the map. Jesse is part of it. God help me, he's one of them. He's not my husband. He's my jailer. Joyce slammed the journal shut, her mind reeling. Dalton, the map. Jesse was one of them. It wasn't kindness that made him buy her. It wasn't grief for a dead wife. It was a lie. All of it. He hadn't saved her from a cage. He just moved her to a different one, a more remote one. She heard the sound of a horse outside. He was back. She shoved the journal back into the chest, slammed the lid, and scrambled to her feet, her heart hammering against her ribs. When he walked through the door, he was smiling, a warm, gentle smile. But now all she saw was the monster behind it. And she knew with chilling certainty that her ordeal wasn't over. It had just begun. For 3 days, Joyce lived in a state of pure terror. She played the part of the grateful, healing victim. She smiled. She helped with chores. She spoke when spoken to. But inside, she was a coiled spring of fear and adrenaline, watching his every move, searching for an opening, a chance to escape. The kindness he showed her was no longer a comfort. It was a torment. Every gentle word felt like a lie. Every plate of food like poison. She was a prisoner, and the worst part was, her jailer thought he had her fooled. She studied the valley, the woods, the paths, but it was a natural fortress. One way in, one way out. And he was always watching. He slept on the cot by the door, a silent, shadowy sentinel. She was trapped. On the third night, a storm rolled in, a ferocious tempest that shook the very foundations of the small cabin. Thunder cracked like a whip, and rain lashed against the windows. It was the perfect cover. While Jessie was outside securing the barn, Joyce made her move. She grabbed a small sack, stuffing it with a loaf of bread and a canteen of water. Her hands shook as she pulled on her boots. She didn't know where she was going. She just knew she had to get away from him, from the lie he represented. She crept to the door, her heart in her throat, and slipped out into the raging storm. The wind and rain hit her like a physical blow, stealing her breath. She ran. She ran blindly into the dark woods, the crashing thunder masking the sound of her frantic footsteps. She didn't look back. She couldn't. She ran until her lungs burned and her legs felt like lead. The forest was a terrifying maze of black shadows and grasping branches. The rain soaked her to the bone, and the cold began to seep into her very marrow. After what felt like hours, she stumbled into a small clearing and collapsed at the base of a massive pine tree, gasping for air, shaking from cold and fear. She was lost. She was alone, and she had no idea what to do next. But at least she was free of him, or so she thought. A sound cut through the howl of the wind. A low whistle. A signal. Her blood froze. She peered through the rain-slick darkness, and her heart stopped. On the far side of the clearing, a small campfire flickered, sheltered by a rocky overhang, and standing around it were three men. She recognized one of them immediately. It was Frank Dalton. His face, illuminated by the firelight, was twisted in a cruel sneer. He was talking to the other two, rough-looking men with guns on their hips. They were looking right at her. No, not at her. Past her. She slowly turned her head, following their gaze. And that's when she saw him. Jesse. He was standing not 20 feet behind her, as silent as a predator. He hadn't been chasing her. He had been hurting her. He had driven her right into this trap, right back to the monster she'd just escaped. Dalton laughed, a wet, ugly sound. Well, well, look what the storm washed in. Good work, Boone. Just like you promised. You bring the lamb, we handle the slaughter. Jesse didn't even look at Joyce. He just stared at Dalton, his face unreadable in the flickering light. The deal is off, Frank. Dalton's smile vanished. What are you talking about? We had a deal. You get the girl quiet-like, bring her to us, and you get your cut of the map's treasure. I said the deal is off, Jesse repeated, his voice dangerously low. He took a step forward, positioning himself between Joyce and the three men. You're not touching her. One of Dalton's men snickered. It's 3 against 1, Boone. You feeling lucky? Jesse's hand blurred. One moment it was empty, the next his pistol was in his fist, cocked and aimed straight at Dalton's chest. The firelight glinted off the cold steel. I'm not feeling lucky, Jesse said, his voice dropping to a deadly whisper. I'm feeling angry. There's a difference. Now you're going to get on your horses and ride out of this valley, and if I ever see any of you near her again, I will hunt you down and bury you where no one will ever find your bones. The standoff was electric. The rain hissed in the fire. For a long, tense moment, nobody moved. Joyce could feel the violence coiled in the air, a living thing ready to explode. Dalton stared at Jesse, and for the first time, she saw real fear in his eyes. He knew Jesse wasn't bluffing. This ain't over, Boone, Dalton snarled, slowly backing away. The boss ain't gonna like this. He wants that map. He'll send more men. An army if he has to. Let him, Jesse said, his gun never wavering. I'll be waiting. Dalton and his men mounted their horses and melted back into the stormy darkness, leaving only the scent of wet leather and fear behind. The clearing was silent again, save for the storm. Jesse stood there for a long moment, his gun still raised, before he finally lowered it and turned to face Joyce. She was still on the ground, shaking, soaked, and utterly bewildered. He had herded her into a trap only to save her from it. He had a deal with Dalton only to break it. Nothing made sense. He walked over to her and held out his hand. She flinched away from him. Stay away from me, she choked out. He stopped, his face etched with pain. It was a different kind of pain than the grief he'd faked before. This was real. This was regret. Joyce, he said, his voice ragged, I can explain. Explain what? She shot back, scrambling to her feet. Explain the journal? Clara's journal? The one where she calls you her jailer? The one where she says you're one of them? His face went pale. He looked utterly defeated. You found it. Yes, I found it, she spat. She knew. She knew you were working with Dalton. She knew about the map. She was wrong, Jesse said desperately. She was scared. She didn't understand. And I'm supposed to, Joyce cried, backing away from him. You lied to me. Everything was a lie. Your wife, your grief, all of it. He took a step toward her, his hands raised in a placating gesture. The grief was real. Just not for the reason I told you. Please, Joyce, let me take you back to the cabin. Let me tell you the truth, all of it. The truth. The word sounded like a foreign concept. What was the truth? That he was her enemy? That he was her savior? He seemed to be both at the same time. She was cold, exhausted, and terrified. The forest was dark and dangerous, and Dalton was still out there somewhere. She had nowhere else to go. Again, with a sob of frustration and despair, she stopped backing away. She didn't take his hand, but she didn't run. It was a choice born of desperation. As he led her back through the storm-tossed woods toward the cabin that was both her prison and her sanctuary, one thought echoed in her mind. He was a monster who had saved her life. Who was Jesse Boone? And what was the secret of the map that was worth killing for? She had a feeling the answer was going to be worse than anything she could possibly imagine. Back in the cabin, the warmth of the fire did little to chase the chill from Joyce's bones. She sat huddled in a blanket on the far side of the room, watching Jesse as he paced in front of the hearth. He had a bottle of whiskey in his hand, but he wasn't drinking it. He just held it, his knuckles white. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. Finally, he stopped pacing and turned to face her. "My name is Jesse Boone," he began, his voice low and heavy. "That much is true, but Clara wasn't my wife." Joyce stared at him, her heart thudding a slow, heavy rhythm. "She was my sister," he said. The words hung in the air. His sister, not his wife. And she wasn't taken by a fever. She was murdered by Frank Dalton's boss. The carefully constructed world Joyce had been living in for the past few weeks shattered into a million pieces. "What are you talking about?" she whispered. Jesse finally took a swig of the whiskey, the liquor doing nothing to soften the hard lines of his face. "It's about your father, Joyce, and mine. They were partners years ago, prospectors. They were searching for gold up in the mountains, but they found something infinitely more valuable." He paused, his eyes locking onto hers. "They found the source of the Whisperwind River, a massive underground aquifer. In a land this dry, that water is worth more than all the gold in the world. It's the key to controlling this entire territory." He started pacing again, the story pouring out of him now, a torrent of long-held secrets. They knew what they had. They knew men, powerful men, would kill for it. So they created a map, but they split it into two halves. Your father, Samuel Palmer, had one half. My father, Thomas Boone, had the other. They made a pact, a blood oath. They would keep the halves separate, protect them with their lives, and only bring them together if both families agreed it was for the good of the people here, not for some rich man's profit. Joyce's mind was reeling. A map, a secret pact. Her father, who she barely remembered, a man she'd been told was a simple farmer who died in a riding accident. It was all a lie. "A man named Elias Thorne found out about it," Jesse continued, his voice laced with venom. "He's a railroad baron, a man who buys up land and bleeds it dry. He wanted the water. He tried to buy the maps, but our fathers refused. So he hired men. Men like Frank Dalton. They went after your family first. They killed your father and mother, made it look like an accident, but they never found your father's half of the map." "And you?" Joyce asked, her voice trembling. "What happened to your family?" "Thorne's men came for us next," Jesse said, his eyes dark with memory. "They killed my father. I was just a boy. I escaped with my sister Clara and our half of the map. We've been running ever since, changing our names, hiding. Years went by. We thought we were safe." He stopped in front of the fire, the flames reflecting in his haunted eyes. "That's when I made the mistake. I fell in love. I married a woman, a good woman from a town far from here. We had a daughter. For a few years I was happy. I let my guard down." The pain in his voice was so raw, it was a physical thing. "Thorne's network is vast. They found us. They took my wife and my little girl as leverage. They wanted my father's map. I refused. So they killed them, right in front of me." A choked sob escaped Joyce's lips. This was the grief she had seen in his eyes. It wasn't for Clara. It was for a wife and child she never knew existed. "I was broken," Jesse whispered. "There was nothing left inside me but hate. I sent Clara away, told her to hide. I spent the next 2 years hunting the men who did it. I found them, all of them, and I made them pay." He looked down at his hands as if seeing the blood on them. "But it didn't bring my family back. It just left me empty. All I had left was the promise, the pact. I knew Thorne still wanted your father's half of the map, and I knew he'd figure out that you were the only one left who could possibly know where it was." "But I don't know anything," Joyce insisted. He raised me since I was a child. He never said a word. Thorne didn't know that, Jesse explained. He put Dalton in charge of you, told him to watch you, to break your spirit, hoping you'd eventually lead him to it. But Dalton is a greedy, impatient slob. He got tired of waiting. He figured he could sell you, make a quick profit, and tell Thorne you ran away. That's when I heard about the auction. He finally looked at her, and the pieces clicked into place. I didn't have a choice, Joyce. I couldn't just ride in and shoot up the town. Dalton had you. Thorne has eyes everywhere. I had to play a part. I had to get you away clean. So I made a deal with the devil. I contacted Dalton, told him I was working for Thorne, that the boss wanted me to get close to you, to win your trust. The plan was for me to buy you and bring you to a secluded place where they could question you. The trap in the woods. It hadn't been a trap for her. It had been a trap for Dalton. Jesse had planned to double-cross him from the very beginning. And Clara? Joyce asked softly. She came here to help me, Jesse said, his voice thick with guilt. This was supposed to be a safe place for her to wait while I got you. But someone must have followed her. Dalton showed up a week before I got back. She must have overheard them talking. She thought I'd really betrayed everything. She tried to run. They caught her, and they killed her. The journal. The frantic, terrified words. It all made a horrible, tragic sense. Clara hadn't been his prisoner. She'd been trying to warn him. I'm so sorry, Joyce whispered. I'm sorry I didn't trust you. Don't be, Jesse said, shaking his head. I gave you no reason to. All that matters now is that you're safe. But they both knew that wasn't true. Dalton had escaped. He would go straight to Elias Thorne, and Thorne would not send 3 men next time. He would send an army. The war wasn't over. It was about to escalate, and they were standing right at the epicenter. The cabin was no longer a safe house. It was a target. The next few days were a blur of frantic preparation. The false peace of the valley was gone, replaced by the grim reality of what was coming. Jesse was no longer the quiet, gentle rancher. He was a soldier preparing for a siege. He and Joyce worked from dawn until dusk, barricading the windows, reinforcing the doors, and stockpiling ammunition. He taught her how to handle a rifle, not the old hunting rifle she'd seen before, but a newer, faster Winchester. His movements were efficient, his instructions precise. He had done this before. He knew the grim calculus of a firefight. As they worked, they talked. The floodgates of their pasts had opened, and the stories poured out, filling the empty spaces that had once been filled with suspicion. Joyce told him about her life with Dalton, the years of neglect and casual cruelty. And Jesse, in turn, told her about his real wife, Sarah, and his daughter, Lily. He spoke of their laughter, the color of their hair, the small, happy moments that had been stolen from him. He was sharing his ghost with her, and in doing so, he was making them a little less heavy. One evening, as they were cleaning their rifles by the fire, Joyce asked the question that had been nagging at her. The map, she said. My father's half. If Dalton never found it, where is it? Jesse shook his head. I don't know. That's the one piece of the puzzle I can't figure out. Your father must have hidden it somewhere incredibly safe. Somewhere only you could find. But I was just a child, she protested. My memories from that time are just fragments, feelings, nothing concrete. Think, Joyce, he urged gently. Was there anything special? A toy? A hiding place? A song your mother used to sing? She closed her eyes, trying to cast her mind back through the fog of trauma and time. She remembered the smell of her mother's baking, the rough feel of her father's hand. She remembered a small garden behind their little house filled with wildflowers, and she remembered a locket, a small silver locket her mother always wore. It was shaped like a heart. The locket, she whispered, her eyes flying open. My mother had a silver locket. She never took it off. When they died, Dalton tore it from her neck. He said it was worthless and threw it in the fire. I remember screaming. Jesse looked at her, a strange intensity in his gaze. What did it look like? It was a heart, with little flowers engraved on it, wild roses. Jesse slowly stood up and walked over to the small wooden chest, the same chest where Joyce had found Clara's journal. He opened the lid and reached deep inside underneath the clothes and the Bible. He pulled out a small, tarnished object wrapped in a piece of soft leather. He unwrapped it and held it out in the palm of his hand. It was a silver locket, shaped like a heart, with wild roses engraved on its surface. It was her mother's locket. Joyce stared at it, speechless. How did you get this? It was Clara's, Jesse said, his voice hushed with dawning realization. She always wore it. She said our mother gave it to her. I never thought to ask where it came from. He handed it to Joyce. It was warm from his hand, and it felt impossibly familiar in hers. Her fingers fumbled with the clasp, a mechanism her hands remembered even if her mind didn't. It clicked open, but it wasn't empty, and it didn't hold tiny portraits. Instead, the inside surfaces were covered in a series of impossibly fine lines and strange symbols, etched directly into the silver. It was a map. This is one half, Jesse breathed, pulling a small folded piece of parchment from his own pocket. He carefully unfolded it. It was his father's half of the map. He laid it on the table next to the open locket. The lines on the parchment corresponded perfectly with the etchings on one side of the heart. But the other side? It doesn't match, Joyce said, confused. The lines on the right side of the locket were a completely different pattern. Jesse stared at it, his brow furrowed in concentration. It's not supposed to match, he said slowly, a look of awe spreading across his face. My God, they were brilliant. It's not two halves of one map. It's two different maps. He pointed to the parchment. This is my father's map. It leads to the aquifer. But this, he tapped the other side of the locket. This is something else. Look at the symbols. They're not directions. They're warnings. He traced the lines with his finger. Cave-ins, unstable rock, underground gas pockets. This isn't a map to the water, Joyce. It's a map of all the dangers around it. It's a map that shows how to access it safely. One map is useless without the other. One leads you to the treasure. The other keeps it from killing you. And then came the final shocking revelation. Your mother and my mother were sisters, Jesse said, the truth of it hitting him like a thunderclap. That's why they both had a locket. They were twins. They were both protecting a piece of the secret. My father had the map, your father had the key to its safe use, and their wives, the sisters, held the proof of the pact. Dalton didn't throw it in the fire. He must have pocketed it and sold it, and somehow my sister Clara ended up with it, never knowing what it truly was. They weren't just two strangers thrown together by fate. They were family, cousins, bound by a legacy of secrets and blood. But their moment of discovery was cut short by the sound of a single gunshot echoing through the valley. It wasn't close. It was a signal. Thorne's army had arrived. The siege was about to begin. The first wave came at dawn, a dozen riders fanning out at the edge of the tree line, their rifles glinting in the early morning sun. They weren't the disorganized rabble Dalton had brought with him before. These were disciplined men, professionals, who moved with cold, efficient purpose. They weren't here to scare them. They were here to exterminate them. Jesse and Joyce were ready. They were positioned at opposite ends of the cabin, each covering a different angle of approach. Don't shoot until them are in the open, Jesse yelled over the sound of the men advancing. Make every shot count. We don't have ammo to waste. The first shots came from the attackers, splintering the wood of the cabin walls, punching holes through the barricaded windows. Joyce's heart hammered in her chest, but her hands were steady on the rifle. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was overshadowed by something else now, a fierce, burning resolve. This was her home. This was her family's legacy, and she would not let them take it. Now! Jesse roared. They opened fire. The crack of their rifles was a sharp, defiant answer to the onslaught. Two of Thorne's men went down, knocked from their saddles. The others quickly took cover, the initial charge broken. A grim silence fell over the valley, broken only by the cries of the wounded man. This was just the beginning. They were testing their defenses. The real assault was yet to come. The day wore on in a series of tense, brutal exchanges. Thorne's men would advance, and Jesse and Joyce would drive them back. The cabin was taking a beating, the walls riddled with bullets, but it held. They were outnumbered, outgunned, but they had the advantage of a fortified position and the desperation of two people with nothing left to lose. During a lull in the fighting, Jesse crawled over to Joyce's position. His face was grim, smudged with gunpowder. "They're trying to wear us down," he said, reloading his rifle with swift, practiced movements. "They'll wait for nightfall and then they'll try to burn us out." Joyce's stomach clenched. "What do we do?" "We don't let them wait for nightfall," he said, a dangerous glint in his eye. "We change the game." He explained the plan. It was insane. It was suicidal. And it was their only chance. In the barn, he had a few sticks of dynamite left over from his father's prospecting days. The plan was to create a diversion, draw the bulk of their fire to the front of the cabin. While they were distracted, he would slip out the back, circle around through the dense woods, and get behind their position. From there, he could use the dynamite to cause a rock slide on the narrow canyon path, the only way in or out of the valley. It wouldn't kill them all, but it would block their retreat and sow chaos in their ranks. It might just be enough to even the odds. "It's too dangerous," Joyce protested. "They'll see you." "They'll be watching the house," he countered. "They won't be expecting an attack from the rear." "I can do this, Joyce, but I need you to hold them here. I need you to make them believe I'm still in the cabin with you." He looked at her, his eyes filled with a desperate intensity. He was asking her to face an army alone. He was trusting her with his life. She took a deep breath, the smell of gunpowder and pine filling her lungs. The girl who had shivered on an auction block just a few weeks ago was gone. In her place was a woman who had found something worth fighting for. "Just come back," she said, her voice steady. He gave her a grim smile. "I always do." With one last look, he slipped out the back door and disappeared into the shadows of the forest, leaving Joyce alone to face the coming storm. The weight of their entire world now rested on her shoulders. As dusk began to settle, painting the valley in shades of blood and shadow, Thorne's men began their final advance. They came in a wave, moving from cover to cover, their numbers seeming overwhelming. Joyce took a deep, steadying breath. Her job was to be loud. Her job was to be a target. She moved between the two main windows, firing Jesse's rifle from one, then scrambling to the other side to fire her own. She was creating the illusion of two defenders, trying to buy him as much time as she could. Bullets ripped through the cabin, tearing chunks from the log walls. The air was thick with smoke and the deafening roar of gunfire. She was terrified, but she didn't stop. She loaded, she aimed, she fired. A rhythm of survival. She thought of her parents. She thought of Clara. She thought of the wife and child Jesse had lost. This fight wasn't just for her. It was for all of them. It was for the ghosts that haunted this valley. Suddenly, a new sound split the air. A high-pitched whistle, followed by a deafening explosion that seemed to shake the very mountains. The rock slide. Jesse had done it. From outside, there were screams of panic and confusion. The relentless assault on the cabin faltered. Their retreat was cut off. They were trapped. A wild hope surged through Joyce. They had a chance. They actually had a chance. But her hope was short-lived. A new voice, cold and commanding, cut through the chaos. "Forget the path. Burn it. Burn the cabin to the ground." Through the smoke, she saw him, a man on a fine black horse, dressed not in the rough clothes of a gunman, but in an expensive black suit. He sat just out of rifle range, directing the attack with an air of detached cruelty. It had to be him, Elias Thorne. Fire. The smell of it was suddenly sharp and acrid. They had thrown torches. The dry wood of the barn went up first, the flames leaping into the twilight sky. Then the roof of the cabin caught. Smoke began to pour through the bullet holes, thick and choking. Joyce dropped to the floor, coughing, her eyes streaming. She was trapped. She could stay inside and suffocate, or she could run outside and be cut down in a hail of bullets. The roar of the fire was deafening. The heat was unbearable. This was it. This was the end. She crawled towards the back door, the only exit not engulfed in flames, ready to make a final desperate stand. And that's when the shooting started again. But it wasn't aimed at the cabin anymore. It was coming from the woods, from the flank. It was Jesse. He hadn't just started the rock slide. He was now picking them off one by one from the cover of the trees a phantom raining down death on his family's killers. Thorne's men were caught in a crossfire. Their disciplined lines broke. It was chaos. Joyce saw her chance. She burst out the back door, rifle in hand, and took cover behind the stone well. She added her fire to Jesse's, her shots finding their mark. They were a two-person army, fighting back to back, a whirlwind of righteous fury. Men were falling. The invincible force Thorne had sent was being decimated. Enraged, Thorne spurred his horse forward, drawing his own pistol, a fancy silver-inlaid revolver. He wasn't aiming for the ghost in the woods. He was aiming for the clear target by the well. He was aiming for Joyce. She saw the flash from his barrel an instant before she felt the searing pain rip through her shoulder. The impact threw her back against the well, her rifle clattering to the ground. The world swam in a haze of red. Through the pain, she saw Thorne raising his pistol for the kill shot. She was helpless. She closed her eyes, but the shot never came. A single rifle crack echoed from the trees, sharper and louder than the others. Thorne's eyes went wide with surprise. A small dark hole appeared in the center of his pristine white shirt. He looked down at it, confused, before toppling from his horse and landing in the dirt, his reign of terror over. The remaining gunmen, their leader dead, their escape route cut off, threw down their weapons and surrendered. Silence fell over the valley, broken only by the crackle of the burning cabin and the groans of the wounded. Jesse emerged from the trees, his face a mask of fury and concern. He ran to Joyce, dropping to his knees beside her. "Joyce, you're hit!" He tore a strip from his shirt, pressing it against the bleeding wound. His hands were gentle, but his eyes were filled with the fire of the battle. "It's okay," she gasped, the pain a white-hot wave. "We won. It's over." He looked around at the smoldering ruins of his home, at the defeated men, at the body of Elias Thorne. It was over. The promise had been kept. The ghost could finally rest. As he carefully lifted her into his arms to tend to her wound, Joyce looked up at his face, the face of the stranger who had bought her, the liar who had deceived her, the jailer who had protected her, the cousin who had fought for her. He wasn't a monster, and he wasn't a saint. He was just a man who had lost everything, and then decided to fight for what was right, no matter the cost. And in the ashes of their past, surrounded by the wreckage of their war, they both knew, with a certainty that defied all logic, that this wasn't an ending. It was a beginning. In the weeks that followed, the valley began to heal. The sheriff from the nearest town, a man named Miller, finally rode in, not with a warrant, but with a wagon full of supplies and a handful of deputies. It turned out the law had been building a case against Elias Thorne for years, but he was too powerful, too connected. Jesse and Joyce had done what the law never could. They had cut the head off the snake. The surviving gunmen were rounded up and taken to jail, their testimony ensuring that Thorne's entire corrupt enterprise would be dismantled. The story of the siege at Whisperwind Valley became a local legend, a tale of two lone defenders who stood against an army and won. Jesse and Joyce worked to rebuild. They salvaged what they could from the ashes of the cabin, and with the help of grateful townsfolk who now saw the valley's water as their own future, they began to build a new house, larger and stronger than the first. Joyce's shoulder healed, leaving a scar she would carry as a reminder not of her pain, but of her strength. The ghosts of the past were still there, but they were quieter now. They were memories, not hauntings. One cool evening, as the first stars began to appear in the purple sky, they stood on the half-finished porch of their new home, looking out over the peaceful valley. The two halves of the map, the locket and the parchment, sat on a table inside, a testament to the legacy they had reclaimed. "What do we do with it?" Joyce asked quietly. "The map, the water." Jesse put his arm around her, his touch now a familiar comfort. "Our fathers wanted it to be for the people," he said. "We'll honor that. We'll set up a trust, work with the towns. We'll make sure it's used to help this territory grow, not to make one person rich. We'll do what they couldn't." Joyce leaned her head on his shoulder, a feeling of peace settling over her for the first time in her life. She had gone from a piece of property to a guardian of a legacy. She had found not just a home, but a purpose, and she had found a partner. It's not love, she had thought all those weeks ago. But now standing here, she knew what it was. It was deeper than that. It was trust, respect, and a bond forged in fire and loss. It was the quiet understanding between two survivors who had found in each other the missing pieces of their own souls. It was the beginning of love. You know, she said, a small smile playing on her lips. You spent $50 on me, your life savings. He looked down at her, a genuine warm smile reaching his eyes, erasing the last of the shadows. Best investment I ever made. They stood in comfortable silence as the night deepened, the stars wheeling overhead, ancient and constant. Their story wasn't a simple one. It was a messy, violent, and complicated tale of secrets and survival. But it was their story, and it was far from over. They had a future to build, a legacy to protect, and a life to live, together in the quiet valley they had fought so hard to call their own. If you were on the edge of your seat through Jesse and Joyce's story, and you believe in the power of fighting for what's right, no matter the odds, then you're in the right place. Stories like this, about hidden strengths and unexpected heroes, are what we're all about. So hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell, because you don't want to miss the next incredible story we have waiting for you. Thanks for watching.